Welcome to the Fales Library. My name is Marvin Taylor, and I'm the director here. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to What's the Matter with Mass-Produced Meat? I think many of you are here, so you have some sense of what's wrong with mass-produced meat. It's a great opportunity and an honor for us to co-sponsor this with Kitchen Table Talks and Eating Liberally. And I'd like to thank them for suggesting that we come here, and also for Dan Imhoff for calling me up and saying, hey, we're doing this event. Are you interested in co-sponsoring? And I said, of course we are, because we have one of the largest food studies collections in the country. As of a few weeks ago, when Jennifer and George Lang donated their collection of some 21,000 books to our holdings, bringing us to somewhere over 55,000 volumes in the collection that we built in the last 8 years, thanks to Marion's help and Clark Wolf and several other people. So that's why you're here in the Rare Book Library, because we collect the history of food very seriously. I'm sort of a talking head because you're really up here to listen to other people. So I'd like to thank Paula Crossfield and Carrie Truman for helping organize this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at the reception following the panel. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, now it's my turn to thank Marvin. And by the way, did you all see the great article about Fales Library that was in the New York Times recently about Marvin and about Marion and how they have built this amazing library in a relatively short period of time? And so we're really pleased that we get to have this event here. And I want to thank not just Marvin, but also Liz Wiest and the rest of the Fales folks, and Tegan from the NYU bookstore, and also Northern Spy, who's taking care of the delicious sustainable snacks that we'll be having after the panel. But first, I want to say a few words. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Eating Liberally, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Paula, who's going to be the moderator, and she'll tell you a little bit more about Kitchen Table Talks. And many of you know Paula from the fine work she does. Oh, did the mic just die?
Yes.
Okay. Is it back on? Okay, great. Thanks. So you know her as editor of Civil Eats, but tonight she's wearing her Kitchen Table Talks hat. Now, so about Eating Liberally, our motto is free yourself from the fossil fuel food chain. And we try to inspire folks to do just that by hosting screenings and book parties and lively discussions. Why does it keep cutting out?
You're standing too close. It's really sensitive, so let me move it.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'm not used to the high-tech equipment. Can you tell? I'm used to more scruffy, sort of bloggy events, so forgive me. Anyway, so we try to inspire people to free themselves from the fossil fuel food chain by hosting screenings and book parties and lively discussions like the one we're presenting this evening. We're part of the National Living Liberally network of social gatherings with 250 chapters all over the country that invite progressives to go offline, get out of the house, and meet up face-to-face with new friends and old to have a drink, watch a movie, or a stand-up comedy routine, share a meal, meet an author, or just generally hang out and lighten up a little in these dark times. If you'd like to know about upcoming events, please sign our mailing list, which you'll find over in the reception room after this. And if you'd like to help support Living Liberally, you can buy a ticket or two to our annual celebration on Saturday, May 7th at the lovely old DCTV Firehouse in Tribeca. You can find the details online at livingliberally.org. Marion Nestle was one of our honorees last year, and this year we're proud to be honoring the grassroots group Color of Change, who spearheaded the boycott of Glenn Beck that cost him 300 sponsors, and I'm sure that was a factor in him taking his chalk and deciding to go home, and he's not going to play anymore. So anyway, on that note, I'm going to turn the floor over to Paula.
Thank you. I'm just going to say a quick word about Kitchen Table Talks. So this is essentially a discussion that started in San Francisco. It's a regular discussion about the food system. And the idea was to bring together the community and to talk about issues and to really empower people to take action on them. And some of the previous subjects that have been covered are bees and colony collapse disorder and urban homesteading and genetically modified foods. And most recently, there's a pesticide that called methyl bromide that's being used in California farm fields for strawberries, and so that's a big issue in California. So we're hoping to make this a regular event in New York. This is the second one. We did one on food waste recently, so keep a lookout on our Twitter feeds, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it. I just wanted to read a quick introduction before we get started, and then I'll introduce the panel. We're probably going to talk for about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, and then give you a chance to ask some questions. So here we go. 10 billion animals are being raised and slaughtered for food annually in the US in crowded factory farm facilities referred to as CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. These facilities often produce extreme amounts of waste, which end up in toxic lagoons, sprayed on the land, and eventually in the watershed, require the use of high doses of antibiotics, thereby adding to the growth of drug-resistant bacteria, and are exempt from most animal cruelty laws. As a result of this mass production of animals for food, there is a glut of cheap meat in the marketplace. Cheap because the government is subsidizing factory farms' costs of doing business in various ways, from paying farmers to raise corn and soy that becomes animal feed, to paying for waste containment for these facilities, to paying America's outsized healthcare tab. The truth is that the system is still relatively new in the history of human agricultural practices. While much of this process developed over the last half-century, without thorough watchdogging by the media and during a period of greater industry influence in Washington, Americans are now waking up to the fact that the system is flawed in many ways. We are here today not just to discuss the environmental, health, and animal welfare issues created by CAFOs, but to discuss legislation seeking to change this practice and the solutions that are emerging on the ground. And let me introduce our panel. So just to my left, we have Dan Imhoff, who's an independent publisher and the author of numerous articles and books, including CAFO, The Tragedy of Industrial Animal Factories, and Food Fight, The Citizen's Guide to a Food and Farm Bill, among others. He is the co-founder and director of Watershed Media, an award-winning nonprofit research and publishing house based in Northern California. Dan is also the co-founder and president of the Wild Farm Alliance, an 11-year-old national organization that promotes agriculture systems that support and accommodate wild nature. Dan lives with his family in Northern California, where he grows a great deal of his family's food on a small homestead farm. Dr. Marion Nestle, who's in the middle, is Paulette Goddard Professor in the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health at New York University, which she chaired from 1988 to 2003. From 1986 to 1988, she was a senior nutrition policy advisor in the Department of Health and Human Services and editor of the Surgeon General's Report on Nutrition and Health. She is the author of Food Politics, Safe Food, and Feed Your Pet Right, written with Malden Nestheim, among other books. Her current project is a book about calories for the University of California Press, also with Dr. Nestheim. She writes the Food Matters column for the San Francisco Chronicle and blogs often at foodpolitics.com and the atlantic.com/life, and tweets avidly under the handle Marion Nestle. Finally, our last member of the panel is Michael Moss. He has worked as an investigative reporter for the New York Times for over a decade. In 2010, he won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for his investigation of the dangers of contaminated meat. Mr. Moss's hamburger article was the centerpiece of a body of work focused on surprising and troubling holes in the system to keep food safe. Before coming to the Times, Mr. Moss was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, among other publications. He is currently writing a book about the food industry for Random House and is the author of Palace Coup, The Inside Story of Harry and Leona Helmsley. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for listening. So I want to start with Dan because his book, is one of the reasons that we decided to have this panel. He was in town, and you say that this is an issue for our time. Could you just talk a little bit about why you think that is?
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out here on a beautiful spring night and giving some time to an issue for our time. I thought that you, Paula, outlined things really, really well. I think an issue for our time because food is really one of the determining factors of a civilization. You can tell a lot about food. Anthropologists look toward food systems to examine what a society was like in many ways. And when we look at our conventional food system, really of which the CAFO industry is the epitome, you find almost everything that's wrong with our disconnection to food production. Let's go back in history quite far. We went through a hunter-gatherer period a few million years ago, and we were learning to cook with fire, and fire allowed us to break down foods and perhaps grow our brains bigger and become more clever. And over time, we began to settle down and grow grains and domesticate animals. And for thousands and thousands of years, we had these food systems that were uniquely tailored to where we were in the world. And we had grazers that could go up into the hillsides, and they could convert land grasses and forbs and things that we couldn't into very valuable proteins. And then we also had single-stomached animals like pigs and chickens, and they could live on a vibrant waste stream. And then, you know, we had to also make sure that we had a steady supply of other foods to nurture us. So it was a very complete kind of agricultural food system that was evolving very, very carefully. And you can imagine the best minds among us really figuring out this agriculture and these very, very rare, diverse breeds that were suited to very particular places on the planet. And in the 50s, before that, but let's say mostly around the 1950s, we got this new idea that farmers were really not necessary. We could just keep animals in warehouses, and then rather than have them go to the pastures and to the feed, we would bring the feed to them. And then we would deal with their waste, and so we created this industrial system. And we've just heard a lot of the challenges that we have, just these massive volumes of waste, this huge addiction to antibiotics. But I think an issue for our time really springs to me that we've really become disconnected with our food in general. And we've given over so much of our trust and stewardship and the regulation of our body and our planet to these bigger and bigger corporations. And when you dig into this issue, when you really open up the doors behind what's going on, and my panelists can do it way better than you really find a frightening story that doesn't have to be, but it's going to take a tremendous amount of willpower and people power to get us onto a new track.
Thank you. Michael, as an investigative reporter, you've covered a wide range of stories. What led you to investigate the meat industry now?
Well, I actually was before I started this, was writing about the war in Iraq and its effects in fueling jihad insurgents in northern Africa and other parts of the Middle East. And my colleague David Rode got kidnapped by the Taliban, and my editor Christine Kay said, you know, Michael, why don't we think about something else for a while? I'm a little overstressed at the moment because I was going to places like Algeria and Syria and Lebanon camps, etc., looking and talking to jihadists. And she goes, well, how about peanuts? And I go, you gotta be kidding. You know, here I am, a big investigative reporter at the New York Times, you're talking to me about peanuts. She goes, no. Think about it, you know, peanuts, a healthy product, people are feeding it to their kids sometimes in place of meat, and they're killing little kids and sickening adults all over the country. And this, of course, was this outbreak from this factory down in Georgia, USA. And, of course, she's right. She's the first person who put me on Don Rumsfeld and his, infamous quote about going to war with what you have, not with what you want, and how, I wrote about the underarming of U.S. soldiers in Iraq. So she has a brilliant sort of instinct for big, sort of powerful stories. So I went to Georgia and I poked around, we did some reporting, and remember that basic story. The story became sort of how the food industry had totally lost control of its ingredients. The peanuts from this factory in Georgia was going into hundreds of products around the country, and it took weeks and weeks before companies even realized they had been buying peanuts from that company, that factory, because they were going through various middlemen and getting ground up or mushed up or what have you before they ended up in snacks and what have you. So it also became a story about sort of the FDA's sort of inability or unwanting to inspect those factories. It had been some months before an FDA inspector had even gone to the factory, and they basically had abdicated responsibility to state inspectors who were underfunded and barely had a budget to travel around the country and had no expertise in salmonella and or peanut factories per se. And the companies themselves were relying on something called third-party inspections, which in this case involved people trained by a bakery group who again had no expertise in peanuts and the kind of challenges, safety challenges you find when you have water in a peanut plant and the potential for salmonella. But I mentioned it because all along the way, people sort of said to me, look, if only the FDA acted like the USDA, we wouldn't have this problem. And as you know, the FDA regulates, the non-meat side of things, and the USDA. I mean, it made perfect sense to me. I mean, I grew up like you, inspired by Upton Sinclair, and we all know that his work, The Jungle, fixed the meat side of things. And one of the ways that he did change things, and the USDA changed things, was to put inspectors full-time in the plant. So it's not like the FDA where they come around a couple times a year or once a year. Meat plants, they've got guys and gals in there all the time looking at the whole process. So of course it's fine. But then I ran across sort of this really interesting salmonella outbreak in a banquet chicken pot pie. And what was interesting is that it had both veggies and meat in it. Uh-oh. And the investigation was handled by the USDA, so I said, well, this will be fun. Like, what happened with this? And it turns out it was a total disaster. They couldn't figure out where the salmonella was coming from. They couldn't trace it back. They couldn't tell if it was the peas from Mexico or the turkey from Iowa. And so Banquet ConAgra decided to kind of shift what they call the kill step in the industry, which is, if we can't keep the pathogens from getting on the food, let's like heat it up enough so we can kill them or do other things to it in the factory. They couldn't do that for various reasons, so they shifted it to the consumer. So when you buy these little 99-cent Banquet frozen pot pies now, the whole back panel is devoted to instructions for the kill step, basically, properly cooking the frozen pot pie to eliminate any potential pathogen in it. We did a little video. It's still on the New York Times website. I'm kind of proud of it. I got my editor, Christy, in the stand up there and try to,
it makes sense.
Cook a pot pie to the instructions on the package and achieve the kill step, the proper temperature to kill salmonella.
Marion, I saw you made a face, and I was just thinking that we had this, FDA food safety bill that was supposed to reform the FDA, but that has nothing to do with meat. So I just wonder if there's some equivalent that they're even discussing about the USDA.
Yeah, we don't have a food safety regulatory system in this country, and we really haven't had one since 1906, when all that came in. In 1906, the regulatory system was divided between USDA and FDA, and the rules really didn't change until the mid-1990s. And just think back at it, we didn't know anything about bacteria in 1906. The 1906 rules were about sick animals. But in the mid-1990s, the USDA passed what are now called preventive control regulations for meat and poultry, and they're really quite good. It's just that they're not enforced. So, to say that just because there's an inspector there doesn't mean that the inspector is doing anything or paying any attention to what's really going on.
What do you think needs to be done then to make meat safer?
Well, you have to enforce the rules you have. They have the rules. The FDA doesn't have the rules. So the Food Safety Modernization Act that the Senate finally passed in January gave the FDA the authority to do what the USDA already has the authority to do, but it didn't give it any money to do it. The appropriations committees have said they're not going to give FDA any more money. I think FDA's existing budget may survive the current round of budget cuts, but this is yet another congressional mandate for FDA to take care of things with no additional resources. That's unreasonable. There was a speech that sort of floated around the internet today by the head of the FDA, who gave a speech before Congress, just kind of outlining what the problem is about the 40% of the U.S. food supply that's imported and how they're going to deal with that or attempt to deal with that. And the congressmen were just screaming at her for not doing a better job, but the job is impossible when you count up the size of the problem. Everybody knows what the food safety system is supposed to look like, but it's politically unfeasible. It's supposed to have one single agency that covers the entire food supply, from farm to table, all foods, no exceptions. And all food producers are supposed to produce food safely. That seems sensible to me, and yet we can't do it politically. So that's politics for you.
So right now we have about 80% of the antibiotics that are being consumed in this country going to farm animals. Mm-hmm. And New York Representative Louise Slaughter has a bill that could possibly ban antibiotics, non-therapeutic antibiotic use. What do you think that would do to the industry, Marion?
Oh, I don't think it's ever going to happen.
You don't think it's going to happen?
I mean, not in this administration and not under the present political system. There have been many attempts to try to get meat producers to stop using subtherapeutic antibiotics. I mean, nobody is worried about antibiotics given to animals that are sick. That's a reasonable use of antibiotics. But the use of antibiotics as growth promoters is the perfect way to select for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which we then pick up, and if we get sick from those bacteria, we don't have antibiotics that'll work. And that's already happening, and happening quite a lot. But all attempts to try to get the industry to stop doing this have failed because of the issues of competition. Everybody wants to produce meat as cheaply as possible. That's the bottom line for all of this in industrial meat production. And if you're going to have hundreds of thousands of animals or birds packed on top of each other, particularly animals, you're going to give them antibiotics so they don't make each other sick. And so they grow faster. Not a very good use of chemicals, particularly since drug companies have stopped working on new antibiotics, or if they are working on them, they're not doing it very quickly.
So one of the biggest issues, Dan, in these CAFO facilities is the waste. How are they managing the waste? And they call it a resource. So I'm just curious what's missing from that.
Yeah.
Why is it not a resource?
I might read something from the book to answer it. Just to give a sense of scale, I was in a community a couple weeks ago in Iowa, and we were giving a presentation, and the community was there trying to battle against a dairy from California that had bought land and was not required to even have a discharge permit to start putting up its operation. And it had started to dig pits to store the manure from the dairy cattle. And they said that they were going to start with 5,000 cows. So if you put all these pits together, they would cover an area of 40 acres in size, 20 feet deep. So can you imagine if someone said, they came into your rural community, and you're a bunch of farmers, and you've had this land maybe for many generations, and someone's going to put in a manure storage containment pit that is carved onto karst geology, a very, very porous limestone, Midwestern geographic formation that pretty much is going to pour straight into the groundwater. And your state isn't doing anything to permit this. As a matter of fact, they make their application and they say, we're not going to discharge, so we don't need a permit. And the Illinois EPA says, okay, that's cool, right? No problem. And the citizens have to do something to fight it. So that gives you I can't really think of a worse idea, right? Of trying to create some healthy farm system. But let me read something from a piece in the book that Jeff Tights wrote about Smithfield Foods. Smithfield Foods, the largest and most profitable pork processor in the world, killed 27 million hogs in 2007. That's a number worth considering. A slaughter weight hog is 50% heavier than a person. The logistical challenge of processing that many pigs each year is roughly equivalent to butchering and boxing the entire human populations of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Detroit, Indianapolis, Jacksonville, San Francisco, Columbus, Austin, Memphis, Baltimore, Fort Worth, Charlotte, El Paso. It goes on and on. Smithfield Foods actually faces a more difficult task than transmogrifying the populations of America's 32 largest cities into edible packages of meat. Hogs produce 3 times more excrement than human beings do. The 500,000 pigs at a single Smithfield subsidiary in Utah generate more fecal matter each year than the 1.5 million inhabitants of Manhattan. The best estimates put Smithfield's total waste discharge at 26 million tons a year. That would fill 4 Yankee stadiums.
And that's without sewage treatment.
And that is without sewage treatment. And Tights goes on to say that despite the huge amount of profits that Smithfield makes from concentrating this massive amount of animals in these factories, is that if it had to pay for similar treatment that we would need in our cities to process wastewater, they would be out of business.
So it's just piling up? What's happening there in Utah? Do you know?
Have you ever driven past one? Can I say something about
yeah.
that? I gave a talk at a meeting in Indiana, and I was driven from the airport to where this conference was going to be, and it was at night, and so I couldn't see where we were, except it was clear it was farm country, and all of a sudden we're in a closed car. I said, "What's that?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the smell was just overpowering, and they said, "Oh, there's a pig farm." Where is the pig farm? Oh, it was 2 miles away. And the smell was overpowering. I mean, in a car, in a closed car. And, between that and the idea, you would never allow a community of 20,000 people to produce waste and not have it treated, and yet this is allowed. That's not right.
Well, and to Michael's point, I mean, what happens to it? There's many things that can happen to CAFO waste. I think the most disgusting part that I learned in doing CAFO is that the poultry manure, which is basically you have a barn, basically a windowless barn. You put a bunch of shavings, like wood shavings, on the bottom of it. You bring in 30,000 chickens. They grow at an unbelievable rate. And as they're growing, they're producing waste, and then it's dry waste. It's bedding absorbed into the floor of the CAFO. One of the common uses of that poultry manure, you obviously want to compost it. It can be very valuable fertilizer, but beware of what you have fed to those animals. But it becomes a common cattle feed. So they commonly feed poultry manure to cattle because there's some nutrient value there. Now, it just adds to the insanity of what they're trying to do here, to really just, whatever's cheap, however we can get rid of it, whether we have to truck it to another state and safely put it on somebody's field, or feed it to cattle, compost it, and turn it into some kind of saleable product, the waste becomes quite an issue. Oftentimes it's sprayed onto fields, and the really inconvenient part about producing animals is they're always pooping. And I mean, like, there's always waste being generated, and sometimes it's not very convenient for the farmer. And oftentimes it's extremely concentrated and toxic, and it's not like a nice manure patty on your pasture, but rather it's a real problem that you have to get rid of. It can become fugitive and go into the air in ammonia and travel for miles. And if you are unfortunate to live near that place, you very quickly get your neighbors together and file some kind of lawsuit, which is often what happens in these communities. Or it can go into groundwater and travel into rivers. And the most crazy part of the CAFO industry is that many of them are sited in floodplains and on hurricane zones, right? So at some point, the weather becomes a real critical stumbling block. And so the idea, I think, is how do we get beyond this? I think it's how do we decentralize this highly centralized, concentrated factory-type farming and get back to something that is decentralized and what the UN says, de-urbanize the world's animal livestock population.
Sure.
Can I just comment on that? Because when I was on the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production, they took us to ideal CAFOs. And these were places where there was an enormous effort being made to compost the waste. And they were doing a great job, and the places didn't smell bad. And there was still industrial animal production with huge numbers of cattle or huge numbers of birds, but they were at least using the waste, and they had found a market for the composted waste, and I thought we're doing a really good job of it. So it can be done.
Well, it's kind of, actually, that raises a question that I had too. I love kind of one of the last chapters in your book on the profile of Joel. I forgot his last name.
Salatin.
And by chance, my niece lives in Lee Vining, California, just outside of Yosemite, and there's a Joel living there who, has a turkey tractor on his land. He's sort of clearing some of the sagebrush and growing stuff, and we visited, and the first thing he showed my 6-year-old was his newly slaughtered pig. And it was really, the turkey tractor is really interesting because they're all crowded in there. And they're there, and he says they actually like to be confined, and it's better for the land, he says, because he's moving it, every couple of days from place to place. But they're trapped in there, and they're kind of packed, and he's kind of wrestling, kind of, how is this different than a gigantic farm? But just my point is, we bought a little hen and took it home and cooked for this wonderful chicken dinner, and we had some carrots and stuff from his vegetable garden too. But he can't sell because he doesn't send stuff to a slaughterhouse, so he can't legally sell. He's producing. My point is, he's producing very little food for anybody but his own kind of family, on a fairly intensely time-consuming sort of operation. Where do you see the middle? What's your ideal farm look like, or do you have one after?
Is there a better CAFO?
Well,
depends what issue you're concerned about.
Yeah, if we went back to the antibiotics, if there were just some generally applied to regulations that the waste wasn't a liability to a citizen, right, to the community, and there was actually good monitoring of how it is a community resource. If antibiotics were only used subtherapeutically, that's going to get to the issue of scale. Because if you take away the antibiotics, you suddenly can't have 100,000 cattle on a feedlot. And then you have to ask, okay, how many, right? So then how many?
Right.
And that's the question, I think, that's really settled on a case-by-case basis. And those systems accommodate the right numbers and types of animals that that land is accommodated for. I think the real question is, could we ever really, because animal welfare, waste, antibiotics, those are all really key issues, and the health of those products. But the growing of grain to feed these animals and the impacts of that is also a huge part of the discussion. So what if really we went from hundreds of millions of acres that we use to grow feed for animals, and we took a certain percentage of that and we converted them to perennial landscapes once again. And then the question would be, well, how many animals could we safely, healthfully, economically have on those kinds of systems? The Midwest would still be a really, really important food production area because they get year-round rainfall, and they would have really great grasses. So, Joel Salatin, whom you read about, who on 500 acres produces an enormous amount of food, 45,000 dozen eggs and so many chickens and some hogs and cows, he'll say that he's still a really small guy. So it's going to take a completely different kind of farming mentality, and maybe there is a CAFO that survives the antibiotic free and proper waste handling regulations that we would need, and certainly Denmark is showing that it can be done. I mean, some countries have gone off antibiotics, and they've shown that you can greatly reduce the drugs, but you have to cut down the scale, and you have to manage the waste.
I just want to return for a moment to the food safety topic again. If you haven't read Michael's Pulitzer Prize-winning piece, The Burger That Shattered Her Life, I suggest you look it up on the New York Times and read it. So E. coli is naturally occurring in the gut of the cow, and it's also in the fecal matter, obviously. So what exactly is the problem? Where are the places where it's entering the food chain? Can you explain a little bit about how that's happening, since we've had so many recalls?
Yeah, so two things are sort of happening in the slaughterhouse. Well, I mean, one of the most fundamental things is what's called least cost formulation. I mean, getting the hamburger down to $1 a pound sort of drives all the decisions from the grinding facility on back to the slaughterhouse. It's all about sort of keeping the cost of the food to a point where the industry thinks, people to the point where they think they will actually pay for food. And to some extent, they make a valid point. Americans don't want to pay a lot for their hamburger. So what happens is, so one of the first things that happens with the line speed is really, really fast. But let me start at the beginning. What happens is the cows shit on themselves being crowded into the packing sheds and then in the trucks when they're going from the feedlot to the slaughterhouse. And when the workers remove the hide, they're doing it so quickly that things like the paddle slap happen. So the paddle is a clamp that goes onto the hide as it's ripped off of the carcass of the animal after it's been killed. And sometimes that slips and slaps the carcass with cow shit that's on the hide, right? That's one thing that happens, again, because they're moving sort of so fast. Then the carcass gets split in half. It's going down the line basically every 10 seconds or sometimes less. And the workers start carving up the carcass. And they're moving so fast, and as Marion pointed out, what Upton wrote about was not bacteria. He was writing about rats and people falling into and sick animals, right. This is invisible bacteria. So these workers, well-meaning, underpaid, overworked, stressed, are trying to spot the fecal matter on the meat that they're carving off. And if they see some and they stop the line, there are repercussions there. The inspectors I talked about before are there but there's lots of vacancies, and they're running around the whole factory, and it's very difficult for them to actually spot the fecal material too. So it gets onto the meat. And then they have this really interesting thing called testing, which turns out to be kind of not what you think it is. And it's sort of geared either not to find the material, or when they do find it and they do test in the ground beef, it's at a stage where nobody can tell where it came from. So you can't trace it back to the original source and, you know, cause the kind of changes and corrective actions that you might hope. That's intentional as a way of avoiding sort of rolling costly recalls. You have an outbreak of hamburger at a grinding facility. It got its material from all of the slaughterhouse suppliers. They in turn sent out, you know, the material, the trimmings, to a whole bunch of other grinders. That strategy of only testing the ground beef when it's all mixed together avoids kind of the trace back and then going out and tracing it and back to the industry would be a complete nightmare. So one interesting thing I'll just finish up is that when I was reporting it, the industry, the USDA had, you know, sent out a survey to slaughterhouses to see kind of what practices they were using. And interesting enough, one group of slaughterhouses was doing something I thought was totally fascinating, which is that they were scrubbing the cows before they killed them. Which I thought was like kind of interesting. But it turns out only 7% of them were doing it because it's very time consuming. At least they were attempting to stop the contamination sort of before it happened.
Usually, oh, sorry, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
what about the gray slime?
Oh, so, yes. So there's a product that's called sort of ammoniated trim. It has I think it's fine, lean, textured trim, and it's a very lean material that the grinders love because when they mix it with the fatty material that they can buy from the slaughterhouses, it brings down the fat content to the perfect level that the retailers want. It deals with the pathogen contamination problem by infusing the material, and they're taking this particular material from the most exposed and the most kind of vulnerable part of the carcass, the outer part, and the most exposed to fecal matter and contamination. And their strategy has been to infuse it with ammonia to raise the pH and kill the pathogens in that manner. And that's, you know, and you see this sort of strategy in other places too. Chickens are doused with a chlorine solution after the fact as a way of killing potential salmonella on chickens. There was an export dust-up recently where Russia decided it wasn't going to take any more chlorinated chickens, probably for political reasons. So that's another strategy, which is if we can't keep it off the animals in the first place and we can't test our way to safety, let's just douse it with zapping, right, the whole radiation.
So Marion, normally the onus is placed on the consumer to cook properly the meat. So why is this not an effective method?
People don't cook.
Well, aside from that.
I mean, it's... Fortunately, most E. coli aren't harmful. It's just these bad ones that are. But people...
Can you get rid of them with cooking or not?
Oh, yeah. Cooking kills bacteria quite effectively. And so does radiation, and that's why there's this big push from the industry to allow irradiation of hamburger meat because, you know, it's sort of after the fact. Hamburger is particularly a problem because, for two reasons. One is it comes from lots of animals. I mean, one of the factoids that I write about in my book, Safe Food, was a study that was done by Department of Agriculture scientists where they counted up the number of animals that contributed parts to 1 pound of ground meat, and it was something in the order of 400. So if one of those animals has E. coli on it, then all of the meat that's ground in with that is going to have E. coli. So that's one problem. The other problem with hamburgers, it's got a really big surface area. Steak, you don't have to worry about so much. You slap a steak on a griddle and sear the outside of it. You've killed the bacteria. But with hamburger, you've got all this interior surface area that could have bacteria on it, and if it's not cooked to well done, then you don't have a kill step. And the original E. coli problem, which was with Jack in the Box hamburgers, they were supposed to be heating the meat to 155 degrees Fahrenheit, but they really were only heating it to 120, as it turned out, and that wasn't enough to kill the bacteria. Well, I don't know how many of you sit with a thermometer in whatever it is you're cooking. I don't. And people don't cook meat to make it completely cooked all the way through. Also, you can't tell by looking at it whether it's been cooked all the way through. So there's lots of places to make mistakes. And the business about you can't expect people to cook hamburger to the temperature that the federal officials deem safe. People just aren't going to do it. It doesn't taste good. It's overcooked. I was thinking that it's not only a meat problem, but Nestle, not any relation, but the Nestle company makes Nestle's cookie dough, and it's uncooked and it's in a roll, and you open it up and you slice it up and you put it on a cookie sheet and cook it. And in 2009 there was a recall of Nestle's cookie dough because there was a big E. coli problem. And Nestle started out by saying, but we have a warning labels telling people not to eat raw cookie dough. Nobody cannot eat raw cookie dough. And they know that. Actually, this is a company that takes safety procedures, that does everything right. They were floored by it. They couldn't figure out where it came from. It turned out it was in the flour. How did E. coli 0157 get in flour?
So it's actually pretty common, actually.
Well, it's because it's been exposed to animal waste somewhere along the line.
And the other issue with cooking, too, is actually cross-contamination. One of my other favorite videos, and you can still find it, I think it's called Hamburger Confidential. We took some hamburger and we infected it with a non-deadly form of E. coli that functions like the 0157. And then we proceeded, again with my editor Christine in my kitchen, to make hamburgers according to the USDA directions. And we had our thermometer, and those hamburgers are well cooked. And we had scoured the kitchen before, sanitized it, and then we swabbed it afterward. And we had managed to spread this E. coli
all over the kitchen.
So, you don't even need to eat. You can be having dinner with, you can be a vegetarian having dinner with your pal who's making hamburgers, and you can be the one to get the pathogen, and he can go scot-free. So it is complicated.
And in your story, the E. coli that this young dancer ate was a tragic mistake, or a tragic result, right?
Yeah, sure. It's that kind of E. coli. If it can be deadly, and it can be hugely sort of devastating to your biology. The other issue with kind of these outbreaks is that the state health department investigators who chase after this stuff are very few and far between. That's why these outbreaks all happen in like Oregon and Minnesota, because those are the states that have really aggressive, state health people who will chase after stuff. You never see outbreaks in the South because they don't bother to investigate down there or trace it back to
or report them.
Or report them. Yeah.
What I found that was interesting about your story is that the meat came from so many different places, including Uruguay. And
Right.
so why is it that Cargill is the company that goes down in the lawsuit and not the slaughterhouses where the meat is being processed, and how come the slaughterhouses aren't held responsible?
Well, because typically, again, as sort of explained, is that in Cargill at the time was pulling trimmings from some 55 slaughterhouse suppliers and making its hamburger. Not every hamburger, but 55 suppliers were coming into the factory sort of that over time on a regular basis. And again, when there's an outbreak, typically it gets traced to the grinding facility because that's as far as they can trace it back. In this case, Stephanie was, lucky enough, her lawyer was lucky enough, she ultimately sued Cargill after the story came out, but, we're lucky enough to sort of trace back the hamburger that she ate because of the timestamp on the package to the Cargill facility that did the grinding. And that's typically where litigation ends. There's one lawyer in Seattle who handles something like 90% of the foodborne illness cases.
Very effectively.
And he acknowledges that, hey, in an ideal world, he would go after the slaughterhouses, but Cargill has a big, bankroll, and that's basically all he needs to do for his client. And reasonably, too, that's as far back as he can trace things back. So when I got a hold of the grinding sheets that recorded the trimmings, the supplies that went into her hamburger, it was kind of the first time that sort of opened the door on and allowed me to go back and report on the various suppliers that went into that hamburger.
I wonder, Dan, if you could talk a little bit about the EPA and their role in trying to regulate CAFOs. It's kind of making the Farm Bureau and other organizations pitch a fit right now. So maybe you could explain what they're trying to do and how it could or could not be effective.
Well, a CAFO is a designation of the EPA under the Clean Water Act. It goes back to the 1970s. The EPA was started by Richard Nixon, and CAFOs were brought to the attention of the EPA by another Republican, Senator Robert Dole, I believe in 1974 or 5. And the reason was because they were becoming identified as point sources of pollution, like factories, and that their wastes were contaminants, potential pollutants to the water and to the air. And so really, the organization, the government agency really that is charged with regulating CAFO waste is the EPA. And they set rules that then state EPAs have to implement. The CAFO industry, though, has really very strategically gone after states which don't have really strong enforcement. And so you have heavy concentrations of certain types of animal production in certain states. And what you find is that the EPA doesn't have enough people to do its job. It's really, really difficult to be constantly monitoring discharges. And you have increasingly lobbies that are trying to defund the EPA because they're making it really a lot harder to do business. One of the parting gifts to the CAFO industry of the Bush administration was that they basically gave the CAFO industry a free pass on reporting air emissions. And this is really important because CAFOs are some of the biggest ammonia emitters in the country, and it's a serious health pollutant. And that's where we are right now. Again, when we were in Illinois just a few weeks ago, a group of citizens, the Illinois Citizens for Clean Air and Water, they raised money, they got a legal team together, and they basically petitioned the US EPA to crack down or just look at the Illinois EPA, because they had allowed a large number of CAFOs in their state to operate without a pollution discharge permit that they're supposed to have. So, and the EPA said, yeah, you're right. So this is what the citizens are really up against. You have these people in these communities that really have to do the job that the agency is charged to do. And the big irony is that a CAFO is called a CAFO because of the EPA, but the EPA no longer really is doing a very good job of enforcing the law that they wrote to regulate them.
Is it true that because CAFOs have a farm designation, that they aren't necessarily under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, or there's a lot of loopholes for them because they have that designation?
You know, it depends on state to state, and however, yes, the industry has gone very, very far by sort of hiding behind this bucolic image that they are farms and they are not factories. You know, it's if as Tite says, and as many writers and scholars have really made the very persuasive argument, if the industry had to pay the cost of cleanup, it probably could not keep going.
So animal welfare is often used as a wedge issue between consumers and farmers, and I'm just wondering if there's a case to be made for animal welfare to make our food safer as well, if those two things are related. Marion?
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, on the Pew Commission, which was a 2-year investigation of CAFOs, basically, by a team of government, scientific, and by public health officials. One of the things that seemed, one of the main conclusions of the investigation was that the laws actually existed, but they're not being enforced. And, you know, so that the first recommendation was enforce the law and let's start dealing with this. But the report talked about the 4 effects of CAFOs on animals, on the workers who were working with them, on the quality of the environment in which they were placed, and on the communities in which these places exist. And every single one of these had a whole series of issues connected with it, with the treatment of animals being one of the more complicated ones, because, you know, if you're going to decide that you're going to eat meat, that animal is going to be dead at the time that you do it. And so then the question is, where do you draw the line, and how do you make ethical decisions or moral decisions or practical decisions about how the animals are going to be treated during the period that they're living before they're killed? And I think for many of us, just looking at it, the most difficult one to deal with were not the pigs or the cattle. It was the chickens. The chickens either in the cages or out of the cages. It was very, very hard to see that, and the sow crates. And the sow crates are so shocking that even when, for somebody like me who had heard about them, knew what they were, when you see a pregnant sow in a cage that prevents her from doing anything except standing up, lying down, she can't turn around and can't do anything except stand up and lie down and eat, you know, your first reaction is, why are you doing this? When there are plenty of other places that have pigs running around, at least outside, and seem to have been rolling around in the mud and doing pig-like things and seemingly much happier. And the people who produce pigs like that claim that their productivity rate in producing pigs is only slightly less than what you get in a CAFO at much lower humane cost. So this can be done, but we'll have to pay more for meat. And maybe not even that much more. That's the other part that bothers me so much, is that in talking to executives from Smithfield, they're talking about pennies a pound. They're not talking about dollars a pound. They're talking about pennies a pound. Most people would be willing to pay that, I think.
Dan, could you talk a little bit about the new rule that's being proposed after the DOJ has, you know, looked into competition in the meat industry and the industry in general, and how that would impact farmers, or how that impacts farmers now, and how that would change?
Talk about that bill.
Which bill?
The one that doesn't let you take pictures of.
Oh, yeah.
Let's
absolutely.
talk about that too.
There's so many. You know, it's the GIPSA rule. It's the Grain Inspection Packers Stockyards Administration. It's a, you know, it's a rule that governs ownership of grain and livestock and processing facilities goes back a long time. And for many, many years, the small farmers, the independent farmers, of which at one time there were millions, have said that the system is really unfair because the big firms that really control these industries are so big, and they own the processing facilities, and they own the breeding facilities, and they own the animals, and the animals are really just given to the farmers sort of as a babysitting service. And because they have control of so many aspects of the production, especially on the processing end, there are fewer and fewer slaughtering facilities. They're bigger and bigger, as Michael was saying. The speed is just unbelievable. I was in a small chicken house where they were doing 30,000 birds a day, and in the big houses they're doing 30,000 birds an hour and 3,000 hogs an hour, and so what we have is just this incredible consolidation of the industry. And if you're small, or not if you're small, if you're medium size, you have a real hard time getting your animals into the processing lines, and oftentimes you're squeezed out and then bought out. And as part of the last Farm Bill, there was a competition title, and the USDA was to look into these anti-competitive monopoly-like structures in the industry. And they held a series of meetings, the Department of Justice as well as the USDA, around the country, and they looked at a number of things, and not just in the animal industry, but in food production in general, because it is highly, highly centralized. The one thing that I took away was a quote from a chicken farmer from West Virginia at one of the hearings, where he said, "The average bucket of chicken in our area sells for $27.95. Maybe it was $26.95. And the farmer that grows the chicken for the bucket makes 30 cents. So there's a huge amount of money that's being built along this value chain, and it's not going to the farmer. Many of these operators, they're really more like indentured servants than they are independent farmers like we would like. And so there are some recommendations that processors cannot own, packers cannot own the animals, and therefore be able to manipulate the markets the way they do, but they have not been yet enforced. So they've had the hearings, they've made recommendations, but no actions have been taken as far as I know.
Thank you for that. Marion brought up something that's really important, which is there's many ways that the industry is kind of coming up with ways to control the amount of knowledge that we have about what goes on inside CAFOs. And if you take a look in the back, Dan has an accompaniment to his book, which has tons of photographs of inside CAFOs. It's really interesting. You should definitely take a look at it. But a lot of those would become illegal in certain states where they're proposing laws to basically ban whistleblowers or people who go in to take a job in a facility, photograph it, and then come out and basically show what's going on inside them. So what kind of impact do you think this kind of legislation could have on the industry and the reporting on the industry? Anyone who wants to take it?
Do you want to say what the legislation is, or is there?
Well,
is there more
I really don't know very much about it. It's Bill
Florida,
589
Iowa, and Minnesota.
in Iowa.
Yeah.
Somebody's asked a question about it, making it a felony to take photos of illegal activities. But this reminds me of the veggie libel laws that 13 states have passed that make it illegal to say anything bad about a food. And this was the famous Oprah Winfrey case in which the cattlemen sued her in Texas because on one of her shows, somebody on one of her shows said that they would never eat meat because of the danger of mad cow disease. And they took her to court and they lost, but it cost her $1 million in legal fees. Most people don't have $1 million to spend on legal fees. So the word that's usually used to talk about these things is chilling. What I think is so interesting about it is that the same people who are trying to do this are exactly the same people who are demanding the right of free speech for corporations. So corporations can have the right of free speech, but individuals cannot, apparently. And I don't think this would hold up if it went to a Supreme Court, but there hasn't been a case yet that's gone up that high. And nobody wants to be involved in that kind of litigation because it takes over your life and it's really expensive.
So you don't really think, even if it passes on the state level, it's a big threat?
Oh, I think it's chilling. Yeah, chilling is the word, absolutely. I mean, it will, because nobody wants to take on fighting this kind of thing. It's too expensive and too time-consuming and, too enervating.
In addition to that, the Farm Bureau and others are gathering kind of to start a PR campaign. It's $30 million. PR campaign to change the consumer image of industrial raised food. And also I'm just sharing with you, there's also a Masters of Beef Advocacy degree now at Washington State University. So
why didn't we think of that?
Yeah. So did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to say a few more things. And one is, they don't want you to know. Okay, that's the reason that they're trying to preempt you from doing something that might expose them. And that's understandable. I've put together, I think this is my 9th book, maybe my 8th book. I've never had a legal review of something like I've had on CAFO. We started with 6,000 images and we got down to 450. The legal reviews, the first one was about 80 pages and the next one was about 50 pages that was questioning every single thing we put in the book for liability laws. And, it was a really good exercise. But I have to say that a lot of people are really shocked by the images in the book.
They're shocked.
However, if we got them from about 70 different sources, and yes, some people got them by their own means, and some, we've tried to track down and can't track down, but most we did. And by number, the most images came from Associated Press. And I believe the second one came from Reuters and Corbis and Alamy and agencies and photographers that actually had permission to go in. And so if you think these pictures are bad, then just think of the pictures that they didn't get to take because they didn't want them to see that.
So I want to thank the panel for your time, but if there's any questions out there, please feel free. Sure, and just say it loudly and I'll repeat it.
Okay, I was just wondering if there's any thought, I'm thinking similar to divestment from South Africa that started on college campuses, I think. What do you think about the potential for students, say here at NYU, to get organized and demand that, say, the NYU school food no longer buys tortured meat?
So the question is, how possible do you think it is for the NYU students to organize against the food service facilities here to serve less humane meat or serve more humane meat?
Actually, the food service facility here is trying very hard to serve healthier, locally, more sustainable, et cetera, food. And I think people who are concerned about this would be listened to. Whether there would be action on it, I don't know, but the food service contract is coming up pretty soon, and I've talked to the NYU official who's in charge of it, and he's really interested in trying to do it right.
I think it's also interesting to point out there's groups like Real Food Challenge and CoFed. It's a new organization that's basically helping young people, college students, organize in their own communities, so it's worth checking out online. Real Food Challenge and CoFed. Are there any other questions in the room?
Yeah. Hi. I guess we've heard about a lot of interesting things tonight. We learned a lot. Some of us know a lot of this already, but there seems to be a laid-back attitude also about this whole thing. The books are on the law, the laws are on the books, but they're not enforced. What do we do at this point to make these corporations accountable, to pass on true costs, make them pay for what they're doing? Because they're going to continue to do what they're doing if somebody else is paying for it. So how do we go about that?
The question is, how do we make these corporations accountable? What do we do?
I could mention
fix the system? Because
one.
we know the right way to fix it, but how do we know we're not doing it as efficiently as we can, so how do we make that happen and educate people?
So it turned out in the hamburger business, one of the more interesting companies out there was Costco, which oddly enough I discovered was sort of doing everything opposite of what the rest of the industry was doing. They were buying their hamburger, and they were making 700,000 pounds of hamburger every day for their stores. And they were, but in terms of safety, they were doing kind of all the right things. They were doing much more testing of their supplies before they ground it all up, so they could find out where the E. coli was coming from when they found it. They were buying from just a couple of suppliers because they figured that's as few. That's as many slaughterhouses that we can keep control of, and because they're so big, they can muscle their suppliers to do exactly what they want in terms of safety, etc. And I sort of realized the reason they're doing this is it's sort of like socialized food. I mean, you pay to belong to Costco, so they get a lot of their money up front, and they're very sensitive to customer sensibilities and demands because it's kind of all or nothing. If people get pissed at Costco, they'll quit, and they'll quit paying that money up front. So on safety, at least, that company sort of has become hugely sensitive to its customers' concerns. I mean, I haven't seen that on nutrition issues yet and or animal welfare necessarily, but I would think that there would be an interesting place to look for leveraging.
Marion?
Yeah, I think you do what you do in a democratic society. You vote with your vote and you vote with your fork. As an individual, you decide you're not going to buy that. You're going to buy meat that's more humanely raised or however you want to do that. And then you join organizations that are dealing with these issues. There are plenty of them. The Farm Bill is coming up for renewal sometime next year probably, and there's going to be an enormous grassroots effort to try to deal with sections of the Farm Bill. And I think actually the Farm Bill is, Dan has a terrific book that introduces everybody to the Farm Bill, which is a 1,200-page document that is so complicated and so big that nobody can understand it.
It takes a lot of graphs.
And certainly that no legislator can understand it because they can't read it. I'm teaching a course here at NYU on the Farm Bill in the fall because I think I need to know more about it, and I can't think of a better way to learn it, the hard way. But you get involved in political action around it, and I think there'll be plenty of it. And this is one place where things can be enforced. I'm sorry if we're giving the appearance of being laid back. I don't think any of us is laid back about these things at all. We're deeply outraged. Deeply outraged. Dan is writing all these books about it. I'm teaching courses. You're writing these incredibly inflammatory articles that, and now a book. I think your article did more to get that case settled than the lawyer was ever able to do. I mean, there it was on the front page of the Times. I mean, these are outrageous things. And what I think is so interesting about food is you can talk to people about these things and generate outrage in a second when it's much harder to talk about what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan and climate change, which seem more remote. Everybody eats. So I think this is terrific material for organizing grassroots democratic processes. Get to work. The food revolution is here. Join it.
I've been thinking about this a little bit. And in California, we passed Prop 2 in 2008, which was to try to reform the most egregious forms of confinement. And it passed by over 65% of the vote. So definitely the people of California did not want cruel forms of animal production. And right now, Washington is going to look at a similar initiative, and so is Oregon. So I can see, to tell you the truth, the West Coast really beginning to develop completely new citizen-driven standards for the food system than the rest of the country. I was up in Seattle a few weeks ago, and they have come up with their own Farm Bill principles. I can see almost every city on the West Coast adopting those principles. But your point is so well taken. The science is completely on our side. The evidence is completely on our side. Why does the process completely get corrupted? I think that as we look toward the Farm Bill and we look toward these big issues, we need an eater's pack, a kind of move on for food, of which we do get millions of people to give their $20, and we go to Washington and we begin to buy the bill that we want the way it's currently being purchased. And this is not the way you want to run your democracy, but absent any kind of campaign finance reform and looking at the amounts of money that goes into the whole process, at some point we, the eaters, if we want things to start to go our way, we have to really begin to have some power, some bargaining power. And right now we have very little, even though there are millions of us and we fund the whole system.
I have time for one more. I'm going to choose a lady this time. Go ahead.
My question is about the kind of reconciling the fact that changing this food system will, in some way, raise the cost of food for people in this country who are experiencing a lot of economic downturn and difficulty. And how do we reconcile changing our food system, but also providing for the millions of people who are experiencing poverty?
The question was, how do we reconcile having a more expensive, a better food system that would thereby be more expensive with the fact there are many hungry people who can't afford that food. Did I get that right?
Well, we're back to the Farm Bill, aren't we? The Farm Bill is interesting because it not only covers such things as agricultural subsidies and organic production, but it also covers food assistance programs. It's all in the same bill. I think subsidies are going to be probably the most scrutinized piece of it. Right now, $20 billion a year, give or take a few, go to subsidizing the producers of corn, soybeans, and cotton. Corn and soybeans are mainly produced to feed animals. So all of these things are connected. And the right now food assistance programs are about $60 billion a year, so they're most of it. If there's a zero-sum game, then one way you do it is taking it away from one place and putting it in another. These were the bill didn't just the bill was invented by humans. It can be changed by humans. And the reason that the cost of some foods are more expensive than others has a lot to do with our agricultural policy. So you want to bring agriculture. One of the approaches will be to try to bring agricultural policy in line with health policy. A lot of it will be driven by obesity, I think. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. This is really the first time that there's been massive gearing up for trying to do something about it. And everybody, nutrition, public health, food people, agriculture people, they're going to be really, really involved in it, I think.
Michael, you wrote the piece on cheese,
Mm-hmm.
didn't
Yeah.
you?
Yeah.
And how they use a lot of public funds to make sure that you can put more cheese on your pizza and things like that.
Yeah, so the USDA has a number of these programs called checkoff programs, and they're largely funded by the commodity grower. And there's actually one on blueberry. I think they had like $1 million fund.
Peanuts.
And peanuts probably has one. But the largest by far was the dairy industry. And so this was basically a sort of a USDA-approved sort of marketing effort to deal with a glut of milk fat, because all you women started drinking low-fat milk, and then men started drinking
Always
low-fat
blame
milk.
women.
And all this milk fat had to go somewhere. We couldn't ship it to, I mean, Europe ships their milk fat to Eastern Europe, or used to anyway. They got rid of it that way. So it had to go somewhere. Cheese was like the most obvious place, and that's a basic reason why cheese consumption has tripled in the past couple of decades. And so, yes, I wrote about sort of this irony that on one hand, the USDA Dietary Guideline Panel is recommending that we eat less cheese or less pizza, certainly whole fat cheese, which most of it is, and on the other hand, the USDA was promoting the consumption of more cheese on pizza. So that was my little look at the subsidy program.
It was a great piece.
No,
I want to thank the panel for, talking about this issue at length.